trivia question for you. What state has the lowest highest point? First, you got to think about what the question even is. But
that'll be Florida. Florida?
Well, there's others. There's Delaware is pretty low. Rhode Island's pretty low. Florida's pretty low. Louisiana, but it is Florida. You are correct. But that's a fun one because people have to think for a minute. What do you mean by the lowest highest point? In any case, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And I'll start with just a few things about what I've been doing as Lieutenant Governor, both during the session, but then also outside of the session, and a few issues that I think are relatively important. And we'll see whether or not there are things that we work on when we're in Montpelier this next go-around, starting in January, and also offer some time for questions and answers, because really, to me, that's where I learn what's most important to you. And hello. And goodbye. Just to make it very clear, as Lieutenant Governor, I have a chief of staff of one. And she doesn't sound like that. So as Lieutenant Governor, I have one staff person who deals with a lot of my constituent services, does a lot of my scheduling, helps me with the newsletter that I put out, which I want to address straight from the get-go, which is that throughout the year, although more frequently during the legislative session, I do put out a newsletter. It's a equivalent of a 2-page piece of paper, but it's primarily electronic, that just gives a paragraph or two update on 3 to 4 issues, and gives you the contact information. Obviously, you all know Carl, and you know your local reps and senators, I hope. I would imagine this crowd does. And how to contact them, so that you say, I didn't see this in the news, but if that's coming up as a topic of discussion, I want to offer my 2 cents on water quality, on motor vehicle registrations, on highway paving, on teacher contracts, on whatever it is. Sometimes you hear about it because it's obviously in the news, but one of the things that's interesting, of course, is how many issues we discuss that don't get into the news. And for instance, one time, a number of years ago when I served in the House, I asked the clerk of the House, I said, how many bills come out of committee in a nonpartisan fashion or partisan fashion? Because usually what we hear in the news is the cantankerous scenarios, when on the floor of the House the Republicans are for this, and the Democrats are for that, and the progressives are doing this over here. And you never really hear about the fact that actually most of the time there's good, solid discussions in committees. A lot of times a bill will come out of committee unanimous, and then on the floor become partisan, which is always interesting to me, that whatever party shifted went from trusting their members of the committee that had input and came to a reasonable compromise to then say, now we're going to make it a political issue on the floor and make a lot of media out of it. In any case, that year, 92% of the bills that came out of committee were unanimous. Now, some are pretty, straightforward. It's a charter change in a municipality, and everyone votes for those because the municipality voted for it, unless it's a really contentious one for some reason. But others are sometimes difficult issues that the committee has taken the time to work their way through, and they've taken input from people from all sides and made adjustments to satisfy the different concerns of different folks, enough that they also, we can all live with this. It might not be everything that we all want, but it's something that addresses a fair number of concerns. And this last year we even saw it with the budget, which is pretty unusual, that on the floor there was fairly broad support. The budget committee often writes a fairly unanimous vote, but the budget itself was fairly unanimous. So I put out this newsletter to also bring to your attention different issues that are being discussed that sometimes you might not hear about in the media because they're not the hot topic of the day, and they're not the thing that's going to generate sales of whatever it is that the news has to sell that day. So I encourage you, if you're interested, I have a newsletter sign up, and maybe I'll have it passed around while I'm speaking. And if you want to receive it, great. If you don't, you're not going to get a lot of emails during the session. It might be every 3 weeks. Outside the session, it's maybe once a month. It just gives a little update on what's going on. So one of the things that I put in that newsletter was that one of the big things I've been doing as Lieutenant Governor, which is an interesting position just to lay out there. I'm not really the administration. That's the governor's job. I've got to be ready to be governor. Hopefully not, but ready to be governor at a moment's notice. But I'm not in the administration. I don't run government and administer the agencies. I'm also not in the legislature. I'm sort of the town moderator of the Senate. I break a tie once in a while, which town moderator doesn't, but I'm not in the committee writing language and debating the bills on the floor. So I'm neither in the legislature nor quite in the administration. I'm in this in-between land. And so you really define the job in the role and how you choose to do it. And one of the things that I've been doing is traveling around the state, really trying to encourage more participation in democracy through this newsletter and getting this out to thousands of Vermonters to say, you know what? Democracy is more than just voting every 2 years or voting every 4 years in other states. Here we do it every 2 years, obviously, for all the offices. It's about participation. It's about communication with your representative, in your neighborhoods, which sometimes you do at the local store. As we all know in Vermont, that's easier to do than some of the bigger states. But even still, as a legislator, when I was in the House and the Senate, the number of times I got phone calls, there were the hot button issues that were in the media, and you get a lot of phone calls about those. But on a lot of other issues that actually do still affect people on a day-to-day basis, you rarely got any calls. And my goal would be to encourage more participation in that role. So I've gone around to high schools in particular and talked a lot to young people, because if you get someone younger to be involved in the decision-making and the deliberation and the communication with their legislators early on, they're more likely to be a consistent participant, both in voting and in other ways. And typically, if they're going to be involved in the democracy in that way, then they might also be more involved in the Rotary, or a local youth group, or a church group, or some other organization. And so the sooner we can get young people involved and engaged, I think the better for all of us in our democracy as we continue to deliberate different issues that face our communities. And so there's a range of issues, obviously, and often some of them appear to conflict with each other, but I don't know that they always have to. We sometimes have the hot discussion of regulations versus economic development, environmental regulations or worker protection regulations versus, economic drivers and job creation and so forth. I would argue that in Vermont, we often have found ways to have those two things work together. When, obviously, Act 250 was first created, it was a Republican business person as governor who recognized that a lot of what Vermont's draw was people wanting to live and work in a place that wasn't overdeveloped and didn't look like New Jersey. Now, obviously, there's been discussion, has Act 250 gone too far or not? But ultimately, the point of that is that, we have a huge tourism part of our economic sector. And if we just develop all out, or if we don't protect our water, or at this point, if we now don't work to bring our water back, which I'm sure in this county and this town is something I don't have to talk about a whole lot. You all know it better than most. That's a real problem for us economically if we don't work with our environment. On the other hand, we obviously want to make sure our dairies succeed. They are the backbone of a lot of the culture of our rural communities. They're a lot of the aesthetic that people are looking for. It used to be people saw more cows outside when they were tourists, so that's another aspect that has changed. But how do we address dairy pricing for farmers so that they're not forced to push their land to the limit and then add in those, quote, externalities, which I think many people are now talking about externalities as really the holistic way that we need to think about our businesses is what is the environmental impact? How do we have good pay for employees so that we keep them? As a small business owner, I can tell you it's really hard to keep people working on a farm at $10 an hour. Unfortunately, at the price that we get for our product, it's hard not to pay anything but $10 or $11 an hour, except for one or two people who might be in more managerial roles. But I'll tell you right now, trying to find someone who's capable of managing a crew and some of the marketing on a farm at $15 an hour, which is a lot for farm wages, is really hard to find someone who's capable of the job because they can find a different job with their skill set at $45,000 or $50,000 an hour a year. So we'd all like to make $45,000 or $50,000 an hour, but that's I don't think that's too likely. So these are the things you balance. But if you can keep an employee and retain an employee that you've invested in and trained, then as a business owner, you're going to do a lot better off. And certainly we recognize that we're all trying to do that as business owners. But if we look at the dairy sector, where they're paid commodity price on a worldwide market, they've had a tough sled for the last few years, and they go through the same cyclical roller coaster. So when I was asked what some of the issues I would like to see us address. One of them is, how do we take hold of our dairy industry and own it and make it work for our Vermont farmers and our Vermont watersheds? And for some, this is too far out there. But frankly, as someone who does market my food directly, and as someone who, I'm not a native Vermonter, I grew up in the Boston area, but recognizes my sister who lives down in that area, other people live in Connecticut and New York, if they drink a Vermont branded milk, we would only need 5% of the Northeast population to drink Vermont milk, and they would consume all of our milk. So milk's huge to us, but when you look at the regional economic opportunity we have, we're very small. And if they paid 50 cents a gallon more, $4.99 instead of $4.49 a gallon, which down there, they do make incomes to be able to do that. That's about $10, $11 a hundredweight, or $5 to $5.50 a hundredweight, which, if half of that went back to farmers, would be $2.75 a hundredweight. When you start to break that down, the other half would pay for the bottling or the distribution or the marketing, et cetera. But if, as a state, we helped invest in either renting a bottling plant or the startup costs of marketing for 5 years with a couple $100,000 a year in southern markets, I don't know all the pieces. But I think there's an opportunity there to take the fluid milk, which is also only about half of what I was talking about because we put a lot into ice cream and into cheese and other things, and worked to brand it and got a better return for our farmers than when those farmers are asked to be better stewards of the land with respect to water quality, or some of the workers on those farms, they'd be in a better financial position to do it. So you've got to be able to look at these things from all of those positions. And obviously up in Franklin County, milk prices and dairy and water quality is a huge, huge piece of this county's identity and economics. And a lot of other things flow from both of those two industries, agriculture and tourism. Certainly manufacturing is not insignificant, and you have a proximity to Canada that many other counties in Vermont don't have. But as a whole, Vermont is challenged when it comes to manufacturing and being able to really compete. New York State gives more away in tax credits than the whole Vermont budget. So we sometimes say, what can we do from a tax giveaway perspective to attract businesses here? It's tough. We're not really between here and there. We don't have an ocean port. Our highway system, we can get down to Boston pretty easily or up to Montreal. But we have to look at where our strengths are and where we're going to draw people to Vermont. And I would argue it's in the broadband arena, where you've got young folks, I don't know if I'm considered young anymore or not, but who want to have families raised in a safe community where they could live in Vermont and they could telecommute and maybe twice a month drive to Boston or New York for a 3-day meeting of some sort, but most of the time be here and live in their community and work in their community and get involved in their local volunteer fire squad or their local community meeting instead of commuting 40 minutes to work in Burlington or Waterbury or whatnot. Expanding broadband, keeping our schools really good quality, small schools, those attract people to live here because you're not just a number in a big system. So I think keeping that quality of life is pretty critical to attracting the small business entrepreneurs that are going to be what some of Vermont's future is, more than drawing one 500-person business here. I think that's just a little bit of a pie-in-the-sky hope that we think we could get if we all of a sudden came up with $3 million in tax credits for one business. There's no doubt opiates is a huge issue still. I'm pleased to see, both through the media and the governor's work and the prior governor's work, that there's more treatment available and the waiting lines have really shrunk down. But people's addiction to drugs is a symptom of a problem. It is not just the problem. The symptom is, work opportunities, idleness. If there's not work, there's not things to do, people are going to get into challenges. And of course, with opiates, as opposed to some of the other substances people might use too much of, a lot of that was through pharmaceutical prescriptions. And it's not youth-based or age-based. It's not right-wing or left-wing. It's you got injured, you got OxyContin given to you, and all of a sudden after a couple weeks of taking that while you're going through that pain, it becomes hard to wean yourself from. I have one neighbor who said to me, what's going on with the cannabis legislation? He said, because I'm on OxyContin. He said, I'm not addicted, but I've had OxyContin for this injury for about 10 years. And I said, have you ever not taken the OxyContin for a spell? He said, yeah, I get awful sick. I get like flu-like symptoms. I said, well, I hate to tell you, but that is addiction. Your body is addicted to that drug. I said, you're fortunate that your doctor's still prescribing it. You're fortunate that you're, well, fortunate and unfortunate, but that you have the economic resources to pay for that drug. Because what happens is people get hooked on OxyContin, then either their doctor stops prescribing it or the cost becomes too much to bear and they're addicted. And the alternative is to then buy OxyContin on the street, and then it's to take it not as a pill, but to break it up and sniff it, and then eventually you still start running out of money and you go to the cheaper alternative, and that's the heroin epidemic. That is documented as much of the way, the vast majority of the way people go to get addicted to opiates. And my neighbor said, you know, what's the prognosis on marijuana reform? And I said, well, I've been working on that for a long time. I know that might be positive or negative news to some of you in this room. But I said, you know, the Senate's passed it. The House on occasion has passed it. This time around, the governor vetoed it. But he said, because that also subsides my pain. And if I could get off OxyContin, you know, I would do that in a heartbeat and use low-level cannabis instead of OxyContin or heroin. And I said, well, call your friends. He's a builder, developer. I said, call your friends in the building and developing world that you know and talk to them about that. Because the more people talk about that reality, that medical cannabis is a far less altering substance, frankly, than OxyContin or heroin as far as how it's going to debilitate you. But the opiate issue is huge, and we need resources for it, and we need alternatives for it. And we obviously need to continue to work with our medical community to give out fewer. I had surgery. I got 30 of those pills. And I was like, no way. I took one the first night, and then went to ibuprofen. A day and a half later, I sneezed. And for those of you that have had surgery down in your lower parts, sneezing is not a good idea. So I took one again. But other than that, I said, I'm not taking this stuff. I don't want to get addicted. Now what do I do with all that? You know? So you turn it in at these cleanups. But what a waste of money, and what a substance to have out there. Water quality, milk prices, opiates. There's no doubt that healthcare is a huge issue for all of us, whether it's the teacher contracts or just each of us in our daily lives. That's still a huge issue, and I will continue to advocate for a universal system. There are many, many businesses and industries across this country that have significantly smaller populations than the state of Vermont that self-insure. And essentially, when you hear single payer or you hear Medicare and Medicaid for all, essentially that's called self-insurance in the private sector. Why we can't do that on a statewide level and save money administratively and have better access to healthcare services, and particularly primary care, is beyond me, other than political rhetoric where everybody gets up on their soapboxes and says it on every side. But please remember that single payer or Medicaid for all is essentially also called self-insurance if you're in the business world when it comes to larger businesses and industries. So as Lieutenant Governor, I get to go around and speak and say some thoughts, but also certainly want to hear your thoughts and listen. So I don't know if anybody has a question. Sure.
Yeah, could you go back and address the broadband issue? Mm-hmm. I'm particularly interested, even though I live in Fairfax, and the majority of Fairfax is fairly high speed. I'm in a bubble area that I have barely 3 megabits per second. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to run, my wife has a business, and I have a business, and we're both trying to run it out of our house. And it can be challenging at times. What say do you have, or does the legislature have, in having Fairpoint or somebody else come in and take care of that?
Well, 2 things. I'm surprised you bought an Apple Watch if it's not going to work where you live. But I'll let the rest of them figure out. They know you better than me. I don't really know what the thought process is. This
one's on LTE. I don't need Wi-Fi.
All right, just checking. Well, it's interesting, you know, when it all depends how you view government and the role of government in our society. When parts of our society had electricity and parts of it didn't, the government stepped in and said, we're going to do the rural electrification project, and we got telephone poles run to the last mile. Because in the private sector, it's not worth it to run it to various places, particularly rural areas. So that's why a state like Vermont is in pretty rough shape. So the question is Is that something we all believe in enough that we're going to put our resources behind? And if we're going to put those resources behind it, where are those resources going to come from? And certainly, I think it's worth the investment, whether it's a public-private partnership where we help, supplement the cost and therefore bring the cost down for the Fairpoints or the whomevers, or whether we do it as a public entity. I don't know which one is the right way to go. There's better minds than me at that sort of thing. And then where does the money come from is the other question. And I know I talked about cannabis reform earlier, but what I would do if we did have a taxed and regulated cannabis system is first put the money into prevention, treatment, roadway enforcement, training, law enforcement, and DREs. But you're seeing in most other states that the revenue from taxing and regulating what is already a thriving market in Vermont, let's not think that that doesn't exist, it's thoroughly there. But bring it above board and regulating it so people know what they're consuming, just like beer or wine or spirits. You know the strength if you buy it from a regulated place. But in any case, if we tax that as well, obviously, because we have to monitor it, then put those resources to two places primarily. I would put, because we don't know if it's going to be a bubble of income or if it's going to be forever income, but rather than start government programs and then have money go away and go, okay, now how do we pay for it? I would put the resources into two endowments, basically, or trust funds. One would be the Higher Education Trust Fund, so we could make our state colleges more affordable for Vermonters, whether it be the state colleges or the University of Vermont. And the other would be an Economic Development Fund. And that Economic Development Fund, we would then use the revenue from, again, leaving the endowment whole, to do economic development. It might be for 2 to 3 years, putting $2 to $5 million into expanding broadband. It might be for a couple of years, cleaning up brownfield sites in Springfield or Bennington, or you could tell me about the ones up here, where you've got incredible buildings that are incredible facilities that could be makerspace, and you could have a lot of young people who might want to, live in the country, but also hang out with some other people because they're not quite country people. And they could work in a space where they're bouncing ideas off each other with that high-speed internet in a downtown, in a building that's empty right now because it's got a brownfield problem. There are hundreds of opportunities for a few $1 million a year to do things. And one of the main ones I've thought about would be expanding broadband into more parts of the state so that people could start 2- and 5-person businesses or expand a 2-person into a 5-person business, because those are the backbone of Vermont, more than plunking down a 500-person business in Bakersfield and going, great, now everybody's got to drive to Bakersfield and what? So, yeah, yes, sir.
It's a pleasure to work with you in the Senate.
Great. How are you? Oh my God. Sorry, I should have recognized you. Out of suit and tie. I missed it, Steve.
You mentioned the
You need a bigger rostrum, though. I'm not used to. No, just kidding.
You mentioned the legislative branch and the executive branch, but don't forget the courts.
That's right.
The opioid epidemic has devastated the court system here in Frederick County, and the probate courts.
Sure.
We have 4 nursing homes and a slew of assisted living homes. Probate court is inundated with the need for guardianships.
Yep.
And the judge is still being paid as if we were 1975.
Right.
Over in Grand Isle, the probate judge's salary is $14,000. When he retires, God only knows who's going to take it or who's going to be qualified to take it. The court system has this concept that they can just consolidate to save money because they don't have the money coming in from the legislature. So there's people in Alberg are having to go to Burlington for court hearings.
Right.
It's just insane.
So certainly, I wasn't giving my U.S. history civics lesson that there are 3 branches of government earlier, so I appreciate your adding that. I was talking about what my role is, and I certainly don't call the judges and tell them what to do. But
A list of points.
that's right.
And
No, that's
I
fair.
just ask you not to forget the court system.
Absolutely.
And the need for funding that as well.
Absolutely.
People don't participate when they don't feel they're being heard. If they can't get into court to hear their grievances or just to open a probate matter because there's understaffed and it takes 2 months to even open an estate so you can file the income taxes, deal with the real estate, the whole system falls apart.
Well, I agree completely, and I think the consequence that we've seen, whether it be funding the courts, funding any number of things, is this constant debate and discussion that is had about what can we afford as a community through taxation and government collection, and then distribution, not just in redistribution of wealth, that's one topic, but the other is funding the basic functions of government. And in the constant drumbeat that government is bad, your tax dollars are a waste, every time you put anything in, it's just wasted, has really sort of destroyed that bedrock and faith of what is our democracy and what is the role of government. I think we're seeing that at the national level as well, with continued cuts to various important programs, whether it even be, frankly, FEMA and others that were proposed at the federal level. Many of us, hopefully, will be lucky enough to never need some of the services that we contribute to. Police services, fire services. That's, socialized services. Now, I don't think anyone would say we should get rid of those because the term social or socialized or socialism is involved in that word. We think that's important. Well, a good court system is important. Clean water is important. A good education opportunity for all kids, regardless of whether they come from a broken home or a challenged home or an altogether, well-functioning home. That's important because if a kid doesn't get a good education to help them get over some of the hurdles they've got, they may well cost us all in the long run with various other support services. So, I've broadened the topic, Steve, from your point, but your point is that, we're not funding some of those basic critical things in the ways that we should. And we also need to look at what should and shouldn't be in the courts in the first place. Now, obviously, probate and guardianship, that's court-type stuff. And needs to be addressed in the courts. But we also, every time we pass another law that says you get penalized for this or you get penalized for that and you got to go to court for this and you got to go to court for that, that's a quick, easy way to say we deal with the problem that way. But it actually comes around and clogs the courts as opposed to saying, okay, how do we deal with this, in maybe a restorative justice method or some other way that really helps actually make that person better for the next day, as opposed to just put them in a box in a room somewhere so they don't bother people. Those are all the complexities that your legislative process deals with. Carl's been there now on his second go-around. He knows that those conversations happen on a regular basis. Kathy Keenan did mention to me, I was at a meeting with her in Burlington, that I left to be here around the state retirement funds and at Champlain College with a bunch of different sort of folks from across the state dealing with that. So she did want to pass on a hello, and why she's not here is that she's there. But thank you all for the opportunity and the questions, and appreciate it.
Lieutenant Governor, on behalf of the Rotary.